As you can see, I'm charged with some optimism here after that. Luckily, I wrote a book about it. So I'm going to start, though, by doing something obnoxious, which is while we're reveling here and enjoying our drinks, the cocktails you deserve after a long day at FYE, I'm going to start by reminding you of some ancient revelers who were not as fortunate as us. You may recognize these as figures who were preserved in the ash, people who perished in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii. So in the year 79 Common Era, we know that Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. And we also know that the people were taken by surprise by this. So one of the chronicles of the eruption that is best known are the letters of Pliny the Younger, who was a young poet. And he wrote that even though the earth was rumbling and trembling in the weeks before this eruption, people didn't suspect imminent harm. They thought maybe they were angry gods sort of rumbling the earth. And so they didn't evacuate, right? They perished in this eruption. In fact, 16 years before the eruption of Vesuvius, there was an earthquake, a pretty devastating earthquake in the region of modern-day Campania in Italy. And it destroyed buildings, it killed flocks of sheep, it cracked statues of the gods. And even the smartest people of that time, the sort of wise men of the age, and they were mostly men, like Seneca, who was the advisor to the brutal Emperor Nero. Seneca wrote in Natural Questions that earthquakes are unquestionably caused by winds, subterranean winds, trying to escape from below the earth. So I'm struck when I read about Pompeii and think about Pompeii by how far we've come. So of course, today in our society, we know the science of plate tectonics, the shifting crust of the earth. We know we have seismic instruments, so we can detect when activity is happening in a particular region. We would know the link between a place that's earthquake prone and the risk of an active volcanic eruption in that same region. We would know all these things. We even have better predictive power in other arenas as well. We have vastly more accurate weather forecasts than even just people 50 years ago, let alone people 1,500 years ago. We can predict hurricanes with fairly decent accuracy, 72 hours in advance, so that people can choose to hunker down or evacuate. And we know things like the half-life of radioactive waste, so we know how harmful our waste will be generations into the future. And we know how today we are engineering the climate of the next century. So the question is, does all this forecasting, this predictive power, add up to better foresight? They're not the same. And the driving question for me has been, will we do better than the people of Pompeii? Will we actually use the knowledge we have about the future? As imperfect as it is, we don't predict election outcomes very well or sports matches very well. Will we be able to use that information to plan ahead for the future when we do see further into it? Now, sorry, that's a little too soon. Just a moment, we'll get to that. We'll preview. But I think it's easy to be cynical about our ability to think ahead today. And that's true because we live in a culture of instant gratification where we're all sort of linked to our phones and what's happening next on our message groups. In our politics, we're very linked to the next election cycle. Our news is driven by the tweets of the president. Corporations are driven by short-term profit. And it's also easy, I think, to look at the future, think about the future, and feel a state of despair, whether you look at the condition of our politics or the condition of our planet. So what I wanted to share with you, and the reason I almost flashed forward to that image too soon, is my own story of going from a state of considerable cynicism and despair about our ability to do better and thinking about the future, to gaining a sense of the possibility we have to do better by the future, not just our own future, but those of generations to come. So the story starts about a decade ago when I met President Obama. And this is in the White House state dining room. And as you can see, I have this look of naive hope and belief in the possibility of change. And And after this, a few years after this, I went to work in the White House under that president, not the current one. And I, just in case that wasn't clear, anyone who was curious. And I had the opportunity to work on this problem of the changing climate that David so vividly described. And I was sharing the science of climate change with community leaders, mayors from particular communities around the country, and leaders of corporations and businesses. And I would share with them projections of coming droughts, wildfires, floods, things we all now know about in this room. And it led me away from this sort of look of hope into more of a sense of despair. I'm just going to use the black slide here. And the reason is because often I would sit across from an executive, for example, from a Fortune 100 company, and after I presented this information about these extreme weather events, invariably there would be this kind of exchange, and once it was very literal, and an executive said to me, look, this actually worries me. You're talking about these threats 10 years, 15 years in the future, but my board and my shareholders really care about the profits I produce this quarter or this year. They're not really measuring me based on what happens in the distant future. And so I started to feel like this is an impossible problem to solve because people just don't seem to think ahead. And that's true also when dealing with community leaders, with politicians. When they're thinking about their next election, they're not often invested in trying to prevent that flood that's 10 years from now. So because I was a former journalist and a future journalist, I didn't know that at the time, this cynicism was also tempered by some curiosity. I really wanted to know, and as I left government, I got more eager to know. What are the situations? Was there anyone who was able to think ahead better than some of these people I encountered and failed to persuade to take action? Were there communities that had managed to think ahead, societies in history or in the present who are managing to think ahead and solve problems of the future? And what can we learn from them? And for that matter, what does research show us? What does scholarship show us? I work with a lot of scientists and was trying to make evidence-based policy, and I wanted to know what we could learn about how and under what conditions people think ahead, communities think ahead. And so that journey eventually took me all around the world to find stories and examples of that. It took me into conversations with experts from fields as diverse as economics, anthropology, land use law, biology, trying to find the insights of how we can think ahead. And, refreshingly, it led me to a sense of possibility about the choices we do have when it comes to thinking ahead. And I want to share with you today just 3 of those insights, which are in the OPTIMIST'S Telescope, which you'll also get. But just to give you a sense of what I think are those possibilities and what the examples are we can use to do this better in our lives, and for that matter, collectively together. The first insight is that we are more than our biological impulses. So what do I mean by this? I think there's a common misconception out there that we are just the weak, instant gratification-oriented beings that are the same as the hunter-gatherers on the plain, just looking for short-term survival and short-term gain. Now, there's some element of all of us that's a little bit like that, of course, right? We do seek short-term, immediate gratification. We want that donut that's sitting on the plate, and sometimes we eat it, and sometimes that's not such a bad idea. But we're much more than this as well. And one of the contributors, I think, to this misconception that we're basically the sum of our biology is the classic marshmallow test, which many of you in the room, I think, would have heard of. I see a lot of nodding heads. So the original marshmallow test that Walter Mischel did at Stanford in the 60s, what he did was he offered kids the option between taking a treat right away, a marshmallow, pretzel, or cookie, or waiting for an indefinite period of time to get a second treat. And what he found was, tracking these students for decades later, the kids who waited for the second treat had better college admission rates, higher achievement test scores, better college completion rates. They were winning at the game of life. And so the misconception that arose from this test and the way it was popularized is that there are just some of us who are cursed to being the ones who eat that donut right away, and some of us who are really good at waiting for the second treat and we're going to do great at life. And we're basically the sum of our biological programming. I'm making this into a bit of a caricature. But the body of research that followed those original marshmallow tests tells a very different story. And even Walter Mischel, that psychology professor, before he died in 2018, acknowledged that he wished that the story of the marshmallow test was more complex and indicated what these other studies showed. Now, one of those findings, for example, is that when you put kids in a peer group where they're all wearing red t-shirts, and you tell them the kids in red t-shirts all wait for the second treat, the kids are much more likely to wait for the second treat because they're on the red team. When the marshmallow test is given to the kids of Cameroonian toddlers, it was given to more than 200 Cameroonian and German toddlers in one particular experiment, and it was found that the kids of subsistence farmers in Cameroon waited for the second treat, a local treat known as a puff puff, at rates of something like 70%, whereas German and American toddlers only waited at a rate of about 30% to 40%. An interesting insight arises from a wealth of studies that have repeated this experiment in different settings, which is that environment and culture have a huge influence on our ability to think ahead. We're not just cursed to being as we were born. We can change based on circumstances. Now, I found this carry forth not just in an experimental setting in the research papers that I read and experts that I spoke to, but also in real life. And one of the places I saw this play out was, in fact, in Las Vegas. I went to Las Vegas because I wanted to get to ground zero of instant gratification culture and figure out whether, and play a little blackjack. Don't tell anyone. And I wanted to know whether anyone in instant gratification culture capital could resist that and actually think ahead. And so I ended up spending some time with professional poker players. And what I found was fascinating about these poker players who make calculated bets, and over time, some of them amass six-figure salaries in a year just playing poker. And what they have to do in order to resist the immediate indulgences of the casino, wasting all their earnings at the roulette wheel, and even to sort of make wise bets within poker tournaments and to amass that like chips to play as they go through the tournament, is to be patient and to make much more, I would say, far-sighted decisions when they're at the table. So that was reinforced by the culture of poker itself, by the terminology that they used for each other, by the way they rewarded grinding, taking slow moves to build up your earnings over time, as opposed to just winning big and winning rashly. Now, it's not just in professional poker. I also found this among physicians and nurses, where if you change the environmental conditions, if you change some of the cultural norms in a doctor's office or in a hospital, you can change whether doctors and nurses prescribe antibiotics right away because a patient wants it right away and because it's going to get them out of the office right away, or whether they wait and think about what's better for the greater good, what's going to prevent antibiotic resistance and those superbugs, which we now know are spreading around the world, are expected to be on the rise as people inappropriately prescribe antibiotics. So the influence of culture and environment and social norms can really change how people and whether people think ahead. The second insight I want to share with you is that we have history and imagination. And why is that important? Well, history and imagination are tools for looking ahead. I think of them as telescopes, in fact, tools that can help us understand risks of the future and bring them into sharper focus. Because in fact, one of the challenges we have when it comes to the future is that what's right in front of us we take in with our senses. We smell it, we touch it, we taste it. What's in the future we have to conjure in our minds. It is imaginative, and so we need tools to help us do this. One of the examples of this, one of the stories I tell in the book, is about Fukushima and Onagawa, Japan. So I was in Fukushima on the 6th anniversary of the nuclear disaster there, the meltdown of the nuclear reactors at Fukushima Daiichi. And I was struck by learning about a different nuclear power station that was closer to the epicenter of the 2011 earthquake in the region. And this nuclear power station in Onagawa was actually a place of refuge. People fled from the city into the gym of this nuclear power station, and they were safe there. Now, the reason they were safe is because this nuclear power plant had been built farther back from the coast and at a higher elevation and with a higher seawall than Fukushima Daiichi. And it was the foresight of this one man, who's I'm showing you here, Yanosuke Hirai, that actually led to that decision-making. And what I think is fascinating about Hirai and why he did this is that he knew the story of his hometown shrine, which in 869, during the Jogan earthquake, had flooded. And he kept that memory alive, and he insisted on the power plant being built in the safer way because he had a longer memory. And I think this is really important. It's one of the ways in which history can enrich our understanding of the future, but not if we only remember what just happened yesterday or last week, but when we study multiple historical examples and when we bring a longer memory into the present and allow it to help us to imagine the future. There are other examples of ways to aid our imagination that are not grounded in history, that are actually grounded in technology in the future. For example, virtual reality labs that are helping people understand what it would be like to swim in a coral reef in the year 2100 if the ocean acidifies, versus swimming in a vibrant coral reef today or 10 years ago. And these tools are helping to bring home for people and to have those visceral experiences what the future might look like. The third insight I want to share is that we are heirloom keepers. So at the beginning of my process of researching this book, I traveled to India, to South India, where my family's from originally, and my grandmother gave me an instrument, this instrument in this artist's rendering. It's called a dhol-ruba. And the instrument was a gift from my great-grandfather to my grandmother. My great-grandfather was a music and art critic in India in the early 20th century. And I never knew him. But he was a writer, and as a writer, I felt a kindred spirit with this person in my family. There are really no other writers in my family. And it was also the only object of his that really survived in my family, because when he passed away, my great-grandmother was kind of a wild person, and she sold off all his stuff, took a younger man as a lover, learned to drive a car. This is a totally different story that's not in the book, but talk to me afterwards. So anyway, she did a lot of that, but luckily my grandmother had been given this instrument by her father, and she decided she wanted to give it to me, which was just, for me, an incredible honor, because this is this precious object that she had from her father, who I knew she loved. And my grandmother and I are also very close. And so when she gave it to me, it really kind of shifted my understanding of myself. I was in my mid-30s, and I suddenly began to see myself. I saw myself as the descendant of my great-grandfather and my grandmother, but I also started to think of myself as an ancestor. Who was I going to pass this instrument on to? How would I shepherd this instrument, this object that had survived through time? How would I bring it into the future? And it became a powerful metaphor as I was trying to find examples of people thinking ahead around the world for what I think we need to do as a society. And the question I kept asking is, how do we leave heirlooms not just in our families, but in our communities and in our societies? And luckily, I found examples of that. One of them was on the Pacific coast of Mexico, where a group of 8 different fishing communities have banded together. And contrary to the usual fish story you hear, which is, people overfishing those stocks and everyone going for themselves, and pretty soon the fisheries collapsed, and you're not going to be able to fish there anymore. This group of fishermen were essentially treating the lobster fishery there like a shared heirloom to pass on to their sons and grandsons, to make it a source of making a living, a livelihood for future generations. And they had informal rules among them. They policed the fishery together. They decided how big of lobster and how small of lobster they would catch or throw back in the ocean. There are other examples of fisheries that have taken this on. There are some 22 fisheries across North America that are using something known as catch shares, which is a little less family-oriented, but similarly turns fishermen into the long-term investors in their fisheries, treating the fisheries like shared heirlooms instead of like resources just to be used for today. Another example of a shared heirloom are our national parks in this country. And I just love thinking of them this way because it helps me to understand that an heirloom doesn't have to be everything, right? It's not every inch of the landscape. We have to use some of the landscape for different uses. We have to make some use of our resources. But when we choose as a society what's most precious to us, what we want to save for future generations, and we make rules and laws to protect it, we dedicate resources to protecting it, and we create meaning for each generation, right? If each generation goes and visits the Grand Canyon or other national parks, it makes it difficult for any one politician to come along and say, we're going to get rid of the Grand Canyon National Park, right? There would be an uproar because each generation has given it its own meaning the way that I'm giving my family heirloom that meaning. So this, I think, is an important way and path we have forward. And I want to just say that it's also something that's in the capacity of every human being to do, to be a better ancestor, to leave better heirlooms. So I don't know the answer to whether we'll do better than the people of Pompeii. I'm sorry to leave you with that cliffhanger. But what I do know is that we can do better than the people of Pompeii, that we have lessons, we have tools, we have research, we have models, we have stories from around the world that can show us how we can do better at thinking ahead. I also know from my own experience and those of those around me that cynicism and despair are just encouragers and abettors of giving up on the future. And for that reason, I want to invite you to do something very radical in this age, very radical in these times of despair and fear about the future, which is to be an optimist. And what I mean by that is not to be in your armchair thinking that the world's going to rosily pass you by and everything's going to be fine and the planet's not going to warm. What I mean by that is I want you to be, like me, an engaged optimist, engaged in making the decisions to fight for our shared future, to protect shared heirlooms on behalf of our communities and on behalf of our society. And that is, I think, the one thing we have in common with the people of Pompeii, which is that we don't have the luxury of despair. We have only the imperative of action. Thank you.